Hello once again, and welcome back to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This lecture, number 37, is the second of two on the political traditions, the governmental traditions of Europe in the High Middle Ages. Last time, we looked at England and France and established a few basic themes about the territorial organization of the state, the nature of central government, and so forth. In this lecture, we're going to focus on some areas that didn't really quite follow the patterns that are evident in England and France. In particular, we'll lay some stress on Italy and Germany, but we'll also work our way around the frontier a little bit. We'll talk about Iberia and Ireland and the Slavic world and so on. Now, one or two preliminary considerations. We must, in the first place, avoid the temptation to suppose that centralization was the normal pattern in Europe. Somehow that in the High Middle Ages, people's responsibility was to begin building the modern sovereign, omnicompetent, territorially defined nation-state. They had no idea that that's what they were doing. And if we look back to the remote origins of the modern state in the Middle Ages, that's our preoccupation and not theirs. We have to watch and see what these people did. We must be very careful not to suppose, for example, that the centralizing trends evident in France and in England were the norm, and therefore that places like Italy and Germany were somehow retrograde, somehow peculiar. The borders and regimes of European countries also have been changing repeatedly since late Roman times. For example, if we thought of just two modern examples, the reunification of Germany just a few years ago and the explosion of what we used to know as Yugoslavia just a few years ago. So even in our own times, the borders on the map in Europe can be moved again and again and again. We also have to acknowledge that there's individual historical circumstances that defy handy generalizations. Now, for purposes of making sense out of this period and its political development, I'm going to make some generalizations, but each time I make one, you ought, in a way, to imagine sort of having a question mark in your head, because virtually every generalization that can be offered can also be qualified. Let's begin with Iberia, one of the regions sort of out on the frontier, and see what things looked like in that area. All by itself, the Iberian experience represents a number of the most important themes in European political development. Now, you may recall that in an earlier lecture we had mentioned that when the Abbasids came to power in the Caliphate in 750, Spain fell away. Slowly but surely, an Islamic state was built in the Iberian Peninsula, focused on the city of Cordoba. Now, the Cordoban regime gradually failed, or it failed to attain centralized control, if that's indeed what it thought it was supposed to be doing. And by the late 10th century, perhaps say after the year 1000, a number of small autonomous regions, which we call taifas, began to emerge inside the Iberian Peninsula. There was a number of small regimes only loosely connected to the emirs, that was the rulers of Spain, who ruled from Cordoba. Now, late in the 8th century, in the realm of Asturias, way in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, a group of leaders launched a movement that would last until the end of the 15th century. We call this the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. Well, in other words, the reconquest of Spain by Christian powers, reconquering it from the Muslims who had entered in 711. Now, this war begins in the very late 8th century, but it doesn't really begin in earnest until the early years of the 11th century under King Sancho I of Navarre. He ruled from 1000 to 1035. This long war of reconquest by the Christian realms in Spain, it only ended in 1492, as we'll see in a later lecture, was one of the great dynamics of medieval Spanish history. Century after century after century of war on an expanding frontier. The second great dynamic in medieval Iberia was the extraordinarily rich cultural blend in the region. This was a place where Christian, Islamic, and Jewish cultures lived in a remarkable sort of condominium. No place else in Europe, indeed no place else in Europe, had such a rich and complex cultural experience. Now, Sancho, when he died in 1035, divided his realm between his two sons. This laid the foundations, the remote foundations, but nevertheless laid the foundations for the emergence of two fairly substantial kingdoms inside Iberia. One of these, Aragon, along the Mediterranean coast, the other, Castile, in the central uplands of the peninsula. Castile led the Reconquista. Castile became the great driving force in the Reconquest, and in the year 1085, Castilian forces took the city of Toledo. This was a great moral victory. It was actually an important military victory along the stage to eventual reconquest, but it was also a great moral victory. It was the first really big victory won by the Iberian powers. Now, military success in this period was advanced by such characters as the famous Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known in fact and in legend as El Cid, from the Arabic El Said, the Lord, the master. He was a kind of an interesting character. He took money from all parties and from all powers and fought on various sides at various times. But it was important that in the last years of the 11th century, he was really fighting for the Christians and therefore was very helpful in expanding the reconquest. Now, Christian successes across the 11th century and just into the early years of the 12th led to the Muslim powers in Spain calling in reinforcements from North Africa. Reinforcements did indeed appear on the scene, and the reconquest was halted for a time. Though in 1139, in a somewhat unexpected development, a crusading army that was on its way by ship to the Holy Land, having left from ports in the English Channel, landed along the western coast of Iberia near what is now Lisbon, and they opened a new front in the reconquest. So these crusaders were actually meant to be going to the Holy Land, and they stopped off for a while for a bit of warfare in Spain. So what we have then is a situation where by the early 13th century, the reconquest having been stalled in Spain, as we saw, when the reinforcements came from North Africa, except for this newly expanded front of the war in Portugal, Pope Innocent III stirred the Spanish to renewed efforts. In 1212, the great battle of Las Navas de Tolosa was won by Castilian forces. In retrospect, we can see very clearly that 1212 marked a decisive turning point in the Reconquista. From then on, the military outcome of this war was never really in doubt. What was, of course, in doubt was how long it would take to complete the war. In fact, it lasted until 1492. But 1212 marks a real turning point. Now, what did Iberia look like at that moment? Well, first of all, off in the west, Portugal grew very much more slowly than Aragon and Castile did in the center and east of the peninsula. Aragon became a major Mediterranean power with wide-ranging commercial interests, with interests in the Italian peninsula, as we'll see. A very important, a very interesting, a very rich region with its great city of Barcelona. Castile developed into a significant territorial monarchy. Castile pursued, in certain respects, the same kinds of historical developments that we noticed in England and in France, or perhaps we might say a sort of a blend of some of the trends that we noticed in those two regions. As the 13th century was drawing to a close, the open question in Iberia was what shape any final settlement might take. How would these territorial states relate to one another? How would they evolve internally? Well, we'll return to this actually in a later lecture, but what we may say now preliminarily is that the situation would not clarify before the end of the 15th century. But if the medieval period then, if our high medieval period opens with small autonomous Muslim regions dominating Spain, it ends, the High Middle Ages do, with three important Christian kingdoms clearly in the ascendant. Now, to go to another frontier region, Ireland. Ireland represents a very different kind of case indeed. We saw that in the very early medieval period, Ireland was made up of dozens and dozens, literally dozens and dozens of little tiny kingdoms. Now, the Viking raids in Ireland were particularly disruptive. Interestingly enough, the Vikings, for example, founded a major base for conquest and piracy, in effect, in the island at Dublin. Dublin is a Norwegian city. It's not an Irish city, at least by origins. But the point is that the Viking raids were disruptive, and only very slowly did the Irish begin to form the notion that it might be useful to unite against this foreign foe. Late in the 10th century, Brian Boru, who ruled from 976 until 1014, began sort of rallying the Irish and began for the first time to exert some real influence over much of the island. A next important step was that after about 1100, church reformers came to Ireland. They began to sort of bend Ireland to the ways of the European church more generally, and they began to organize the church on a more strict territorial basis. So we see, as we've noted in a couple of places in the early Middle Ages, that ecclesiastical organization went along with, and to a degree perhaps even preceded, political organization. In the 12th century, a rather fateful moment was reached. King Rory O'Connor, in his attempt to exert a wider and wider control inside Ireland, turned to England for mercenaries. Well, his request of King Henry II of England for mercenary assistance in his own battles, in his own plans in Ireland, awakened the interest of Henry II in Ireland, who invaded in 1171. The English, of course, are still there in the north. Irish political development was in many respects retarded by this English incursion, which affected the island for a very long time. So across our period then, Ireland opens politically disunited and with Vikings attacking it, and ends politically fragmented, not quite as disunited as once before, but now with English intrusion being the dominant theme. If we continue moving around this arc of frontier, we might go to Eastern Europe. Here we'll see that promising beginnings in a number of regions seemed always to encounter crushing difficulties. For instance, the Polish kingdom. The Polish kingdom grew greatly in strength and cohesion and power and governmental authority along Germany's eastern frontier. It was well governed, and it was very much anchored into the Western orbit by its decision to embrace Roman Catholicism. You'll perhaps recall that the Byzantines had been spreading Orthodox Christianity in much of Slavic Europe. Well, Poland decided for the West, decided for Rome, decided for Roman Christianity, and this opened up, of course, also important possibilities for collaboration with the Germans. And yet in the early 12th century, King Boleslaw III divided his realm among three sons. He did this in 1138. And as a result, the slowly unifying Polish monarchy was now weakened and disunited, and therefore became much weaker than many of its neighbors who were tempted and who succumbed to the temptation to meddle in Polish affairs. Another example in the Slavic world is Rus, the remote ancestor of Russia. Now, the Vikings established a combination trading and military base, Swedish Vikings in this particular instance, at Kiev in 862. Gradually, this state expanded. Gradually, it entered into commercial and cultural relations with a number of powers, but particularly with Byzantium, from which it accepted Orthodox Christianity. And yet the state of Kiev and Rus, over 2 or 3 centuries' time, was burdened by succeeding weak and strong leaders, by aristocratic factionalism inside the country, and by repeated attacks from peoples coming across the steppes, the last and most devastating of which attacks came from the Mongols. But we'll have occasion to encounter the Mongols again in a somewhat later lecture. Suffice it to say that they put an end to the earliest phase of the development of the Kievan Rus. So, outside attacks, outside conquest, playing rather decisive roles, different kinds of roles, but in Iberia, in Ireland, in Poland, and in Russia. We can see complex relations with outside peoples playing decisive roles inside. Italy offers us another set of examples. First of all, we need to recognize that we can't actually talk about Italy. The thing didn't exist. Italy was a sort of a geographical expression, but there was no nation, no country of Italy. We can make some sense out of the political geography of Italy by dividing the realm into sort of 3 main zones. Let's begin in the south, all the way in the south, and oftentimes that means including Sicily as well. The south was, like the frontier regions that we've been speaking about, an area subject constantly to outside influence. For example, as the early Middle Ages open, it is Byzantines who are powerful in southern Italy. Beginning in the 9th century, Muslims conquer Sicily, for example, and exert considerable impact on southern Italy as well. In the 11th century, a good deal of southern Italy and portions of Sicily are conquered by Normans. We think of the Normans who conquered England in 1066. There were other Normans prominent in the crusading armies that went to the east, but yet another group of these restless, turbulent, ambitious Normans conquered a kingdom for themselves in southern Italy. Eventually, that kingdom was supplanted by the Germans, who in turn were supplanted by the Aragonese. Now, in spite of all of this turmoil, southern Italy is an interesting region to us because it's enormously prosperous. It's a very rich region, particularly because it has a number of very significant port cities that engaged in far-flung trade. But it's also an area that is, in a way, a kind of a miniaturized version of Iberia from the cultural point of view. Here is a place where the Latin Christian, the Muslim, and to a degree, the Jewish worlds met and encountered one another. So not surprisingly, southern Italy and Sicily were culturally precocious, even at a time when they were rarely able to manage their own internal political affairs. Moving northward in the Italian peninsula, we come to the central regions. Now, broadly speaking, one can always say that the regions focused on Rome and extending a bit to the north and a bit to the south of Rome was the papal states. And we can say that the popes dominated those papal states. We saw in an earlier lecture that they emerge, indeed, in the 8th century, largely with Carolingian assistance. But the popes faced the problem that absent protection, absent great clients who would help them out, they weren't able effectively to maintain their power in central Italy consistently over long periods of time. Put a little differently, the papal state expanded and contracted, expanded and contracted, expanded and contracted over long periods of time. So that to talk about the papal state is not so much to talk about the coherent history of a single entity as it is to sort of try to make some sense out of an entity which changed again and again and again. The north of Italy was again dominated by outside powers. You'll recall perhaps that the Carolingians had come in and put an end to Lombard control in northern Italy. The Lombards had been attacking Rome. The Carolingians agreed to protect the popes. The Carolingians put an end to the Lombards. Carolingian authority in northern Italy lasted, though rather weakly at the end, but lasted into the early years of the 10th century. Thereafter, the Carolingians were replaced in northern Italy by the Germans. Now, German domination in northern Italy was resisted, sometimes effectively, by various leagues and coalitions of North Italian towns, but on the whole, this German incursion in northern Italy and various Italian attempts, not unified attempts, but attempts by this town, that town, the other town, a particular league of towns, to throw off German rule, produced a situation where, to put it quite simply, northern Italy did not develop a coherent unitary political growth. There was no sort of state here. In any meaningful sense of the term. The dominant development in Italy actually has to do with those towns. It has to do with the emergence of the communes, which is one of the most creative of all medieval political experiments. Now, the roots of the Italian communes, several dozen of which emerged in the years between the 11th century and the 13th, the roots of the communes were in the rising agricultural prosperity of the Italian countryside. Italy was sharing in this expansion of Europe to which we referred in an earlier lecture. The burgeoning wealth of the towns was increasingly producing a volatile political situation. Volatile in a couple of ways. Internally, we'll come to. Externally, these towns were beginning to be jealous of their own position. They wanted to avoid the domination of the popes. They wanted to avoid the domination of local bishops. They wanted to avoid the domination of German-introduced counts, for example. As a result, groups of prominent laymen, groups of townsmen, began to form sworn associations called communes, quite literally the common thing, the common affair. The point being to find some means, to find some mechanism for the leading elements in the town to act together to represent their common interests effectively against popes, bishops, counts, whomever it might be. Now, these leaders called themselves the popolo, the people. It is very important to say that, and particularly important to say in this early period, these communes were not democratic. In fact, they were intensely volatile little creatures with large numbers of competing groups inside the towns wishing some share in this power. Who were some of the players in the game? Well, repeated and sometimes violent civil disturbances led gradually to the initial elites who often had wealth based in the countryside, which they had taken into town, to have to start sharing power with, for example, leading members of the manufacturers, towns where there were important cloth industries, for example, or glass industries, as at Venice. Artisans, the people who made ordinary daily products, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, if you like. The upper echelons of the workers in the towns. In other words, all of these groups began competing for some opportunity to participate in the commune, to become, as it were, part of il popolo, of the people. Now, ironically, these Italian towns began as communities dominated by Germans or perhaps by ecclesiastical lords. Over a long period of time, they shifted power to local economic elites. Within the power, the local economic and social elites gradually found themselves having to share their authority, to share participation in the political process with more and more townspeople. As the towns became more volatile, as the towns became more violent, what began to happen is, now we're almost reminded of that ancient cycle that we talked about so many times in some of our earlier lectures. An expanding political power, an oligarchy that was becoming something like a democracy, began to degenerate into a mob rule, which then led to despotism. So that as our period ends, say around 1300, nothing sacred about that date, but around 1300, many of the Italian communes are actually dominated by despotic rulers who have come into being as a result of the political violence and volatility of these towns. Nevertheless, and to repeat, Italian towns were among the most creative political phenomena in the High Middle Ages. Germany is yet another case with all its own variations. It'll require just a little bit more of our attention. Germany, what on earth does that mean? The German lands, the lands that eventually become one or another of the many Germanys that have existed, were of course outside the territory of the Roman Empire. This was an area, in other words, quite simply, that had no infrastructure. There was no heritage of towns, there was no heritage of roads, there was no heritage of organized government inside these German territories. The Carolingians, of course, as we have seen, extended their authority considerably to the east into the German lands, but Carolingian power lasted only a relatively short time. And in an area that was very large and overwhelmingly rural, even by medieval standards. When the Carolingians come on the scene, for example, probably 5% of German land was in cultivation. 5%, a very small amount of it. The Carolingians then just didn't have time to introduce a deep, permanent, stable sense of authority and effective institutions. Now, when the Carolingians died out in 911, the last Carolingian ruler died, the various German dukes, Germany was divided up into 5 major territories, each of which ruled by a duke. The dukes came together and chose the most powerful of their number, the Duke of Saxony, as their king. Now that's significant because obviously the Germans were trying to retain some sense of royal authority, particularly in the face of external foes, as we'll see in just a second. They didn't abandon monarchy. They chose one of their strongest numbers to be the monarch. Now, for a century, the Saxons, the Duke of Saxony, was the first person chosen king in this post-Carolingian realm of Germany. Or we sometimes call them the Ottonians, because the second, third, and fourth rulers are Otto the first, second, and third, built effectively the strongest state in 10th century Europe. And then that state collapsed, one of the great ironies of medieval political experience. The Ottonians built on the basis of a few very basic policies which they pursued quite consistently over about a century. They fought successful wars against their Viking, Slavic, and Magyar neighbors, indeed winning a great victory in 955 over the Magyars. They very tightly controlled the church, believing, perhaps the best Carolingian tradition, that the king was the specially chosen agent of God, that ruling the church was his particular responsibility. They gained immense prestige by being crowned emperors in 962. Again, very much in the Carolingian tradition. But these dukes of Saxony had something now that no other duke had, to be sure, but indeed no other ruler in Europe had. They used very effective marriage alliances. They used diplomacy and from time to time outright intimidation to attempt to exert control over the other dukes inside Germany. So the Ottonian state was promising in many ways, and I think it would be easy to say that if we took a vantage point almost anywhere in the 10th century, we would say Ottonian Germany was the most powerful state in Europe. And yet the Ottonian system failed. Failed for several reasons. Military expansion ended. The dynasty died out in 1002. Now this would happen again in 1024, in 1125, and in 1250. Again and again and again, German families did not produce continuity of rule. Now, we saw in England that that might not be devastating. England had other stabilizing resources. We saw in France that dynastic continuity was a very powerful inducement to the building up of the power of the monarchy. The Germans never got the chance. Families just died out. The rulers never found a formula that let them exert real control over more than 1 or 2 of Germany's 5 main duchies. The king was always duke of one of these realms, but the other dukes didn't really have to answer to him. And that produced a very curious political problem, how to exert authority in the other duchies. The Italian entanglements brought some financial resources. They could tax the North Italian cities. It brought considerable prestige, but also these Italian entanglements were costly. The Germans were constantly being bogged down by their Italian concerns, and perhaps then diverted from paying attention to Germany itself. The gravest problem, though, perhaps, was the struggle with the popes, which is generally referred to as the investiture controversy, the controversy over lay investiture. That means the investing of ecclesiastical offices by laymen. Spoken differently, it means a king, a duke, a count, whomever you please, names abbots, names bishops, invests religious officials with their office. In the middle of the 11th century, the German kings, or emperors, ran into a reformed papacy that had come to believe, perhaps on the basis of all of that monastic reform that we talked about in an earlier lecture, those who pray, ran into a reformed papacy which had really taken on board the idea that lay control of, lay involvement in church affairs was the chief impediment to moral reform in Europe. They wanted an end to German imperial interference in the church. Now, German rulers, of course, from their point of view, in the Carolingian tradition, believed that they themselves, and not the popes, were the head of the earthly hierarchy, a reflection of the heavenly realm. What's the constitution of heaven? Well, it's a monarchy, of course. If earth is supposed to reflect heaven, earth should be a monarchy too. Who is the monarch? Well, it might be the pope, or it might be the German emperor. The German emperors felt themselves divinely appointed to this task. Suffice it to say that the battle, this investiture controversy, went on over two generations, and finally the ecclesiastical authorities won out. We may very well say that in a society that defined its ends and purposes in essentially religious terms, ecclesiastical authorities were bound to win any great ideological battle over authority. So my point is quite simply that that wonderfully promising Ottonian system put in place in the 10th century saw, over the course of the 11th and the early 12th, each one of its key props kicked out from under it. And as a result, Germany then began to pass into the direction of small, disunited, ineffective, centralized control. Now, we've mentioned the Roman Church. Let's just lay one or two words on that particular subject as well. The Roman Church developed in the High Middle Ages the most sophisticated legal system in all of Europe. We'll return to that in our next lecture. The Curia, the central court of the Church, expanded significantly. The College of Cardinals, for example, emerged as a kind of a senate for the Church as a whole. Lateran councils, the Lateran Basilica, of course, is Rome's cathedral church. Lateran councils became sort of church-wide, but increasingly almost Europe-wide parliaments. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, for example, exerted more influence on the lives of ordinary people than any church council since antiquity or than any council to come until Trent in the 16th century. The legal and the financial machinery of the Roman Church was elaborated to collect fees and revenues from all over Europe, to adjudicate controversies that came to the Church from all over Europe. The Pope's system of legates, we might say envoys, ambassadors almost. He could send them ad hoc for a particular reason, or he could make them resident in particular areas. The papal system of legates brought more people into regular contact with ecclesiastical government than had ever been the case before. The Roman Church in the High Middle Ages developed highly its disciplinary mechanisms. Excommunication, for example. Now, this had existed since antiquity. The exclusion of an individual from the sacraments of the Church, a form of social death. No one could talk to, no one could eat with, no one could have sex with an excommunicated person. This was a very powerful corrective measure. The interdict was a tool that allowed the Church to deny sacramental services in a specified region. Now, the point here, of course, was to bend someone to the Church's will, to make them behave themselves from the Church's point of view. But by suppressing sacramental services, people were left bereft of the ordinary kinds of sacramental services they were accustomed to, and they were to bring pressure to bear on their rulers. Finally, of course, the Inquisition, the famous Inquisition, a formal judicial procedure designed to identify and correct heresy, a set of procedures that operated according to Roman law and that was devastatingly effective in at least some parts of Europe. Scholars speak of a papal monarchy, and certainly the popes were now leading the Church more fully and more effectively than ever before. But even so, we know, in retrospect, that the authority of the popes was on the verge of severe political challenges. The great lessons, therefore, it seems to me, of medieval political development in the High Middle Ages is that an astonishing array of entities which drew upon Roman, which drew upon Christian, and which drew upon local ethnic traditions emerged. Rather than looking for a single ordering principle, we ought to stand gape-jawed in respect at the immense creativity of these peoples. Territorial states grew in some places, failed to grow elsewhere. Powerful central governments emerged in some places, failed to emerge elsewhere. But forms of government differed a great deal from one part of Europe to another. In this age of expansion, governmental activity was itself expanding as well, and was no less creative than the cultural expressions of Europe in the High Middle Ages, to which we shall turn in our next two lectures.